Hi, everybody. Welcome. I'm Naomi Gerstel. I am a member of the board of Northampton Neighbors and on the speakers committee, which is bringing you this talk today. Probably many of you know, but Northampton Neighbors has existed for a few years. It has now about more than 900 members. It's all volunteer except for one terrific administrator, Diane Porcelli, who is here today. Um, and our main goal is to help people over 55 stay in their homes. You can join for free and get all our services if you're 55 or older. And you can be a member at any age. And we welcome you as a member and certainly as a volunteer. And we had many services before the pandemic, but we had to reimagine ourselves, of course, with the pandemic because we couldn't continue to give in-person services. So we now do a number of things, including check-in calls and messaging and interest groups, and of course, the Great Speaker Series, which has a speaker every 2 weeks. All the talks are recorded by Nina Kleinberg. She told me not to use too many adjectives to describe her, but she is our tech person, tech volunteer. And let me talk a little bit about logistics. As you probably know, at the bottom of your screen, there's something called chat. And all you have, if you want to ask a question, all you have to do is move your mouse over the chat, type in your question, and hit enter. We ask that you not send in questions if you can possibly resist until the talk is over, because they're a little irritating to speakers and people who are observing. But if you feel like you just can't remember it, or you just got to say something, go for it, and we'll use the chat box after the talk. In addition, we now have something called Live on Otter, which is a pretty amazing thing. It's in the top left of your screen, and if you want to see a transcription of the talk as it's going on, or of anybody that's speaking, you click on that on Live Otter at the top, and you will see a little arrow next to it, which you click on, which will live stream Otter, and then you can make the words go as fast or slow as you choose. What's going to happen today is that Tracy Kidder, our speaker, is going to talk for 30 to 35 minutes, and then we'll have questions and answers. Please keep yourself muted for the whole time, and we may mute you if you don't remember to do that. So now let me get to the main event, which is Tracy Kidder. And as I assume all of you know, Tracy Kidder is a master storyteller. We are so lucky to have him today. He's written 11 award-winning books. Nonfiction books. Many terms are used to describe his work, including narrative nonfiction. Nonfiction is factual narrative or true life storytelling, or just page-turning narrative. A little bit about his background. After finishing college and serving in Vietnam, which he says did not influence his writing, he worked as a contributing editor at The Atlantic with Richard Todd, who became his long-term editor and friend, the kind of editor that every young writer would be lucky to have, and so few get. He wrote then The Soul of a New Machine, which was described by the New York Times as narrative art, which won the Pulitzer Prize and the National Book Award for Nonfiction. Since then, he's written a number of books, among them Among School Children, winner of a Robert F. Kennedy Book Award, among others. Mountains Beyond Mountains, another prize-winning book, and in which he recounts Paul Farmer's heroic work in Haiti, and My Detachment, a memoir about his non-combatant years in Vietnam. Many of you likely know him as a Pioneer Valley resident. He has written about this area in his book House, which is an account of the relationship of carpenters, architects, and family who built a single family house in the Pioneer Valley. And it is just a page-turning narrative. Hometown, a book about ordinary people that Kidder wrote after his stint in Haiti. He started researching this book because, and I quote him, "It seemed to me that a town, a workable town, was a precious sort of thing." But soon he also recognized that this ordinary town, that is Northampton, had its own set of underlying issues, anxieties, pathologies. It too is page turning. Perhaps of particular pertinence to our organization and our aging membership, Kidder wrote Old Friends, another local narrative about two men in a nursing home, actually at Linda Manor right down the street, and about the intense friendship they developed and their struggle to confront their mortality. I could go on and on, but I suspect you don't want me to go on and on because you want to hear Tracy Kidder. He is going to talk today about a book he wrote recently called Strength in What Remains, an inspiring story of a man who survived the genocide in Burundi, which will serve as the basis of his talk today. He describes as well, you'll hear his talk in a minute. I'm honored to introduce Tracy Kidder, who's going to give a talk titled today, What I Try to Do as a Writer, Strength in What Remains. Tracy.
Where am I? I'm lost. Oh, here I am. Okay. I'm going to talk for a while, and I'm going to show you some photographs. A young medical student named Deogracias Nizonkiza narrowly survives the onset of civil war in his native country, the small East Central African nation of Burundi. Survives because he left the door to his room open, and the men who would have killed him assumed that he had already fled. He makes a 6 months long escape on foot, first from Burundi's war and then from the genocide in Rwanda, and then back to Burundi, and then almost by accident, he gets transported to America. He arrives at JFK in New York City with $200 in his pocket, a visa obtained under false pretenses, no English, no friends or relations, and memories of horror so fresh he sometimes confuses past and present. His first trip on a subway gets lost for most of a day. He ekes out a sort of living delivering groceries. At night, he sleeps in Central Park. And then one day, sick and near despair, delivers groceries to a small Catholic church where he meets an ex-contemplative nun who speaks passable French, and he decides that what Deo needs is a family. There isn't time for me to describe this woman and all that she did for Deo, and I don't want to try to describe her briefly and not do her justice because I've never enjoyed writing about anyone more. The ex-nun, Sharon McKenna, set out to find Deo a place in New York, and she kept on trying to find one long after Deo had started wishing that she would quit. And she kept on doing this, infuriating him, finally leaving him thinking that she wanted to find him a place more than he wanted to have a place. But she succeeded. He was essentially adopted by a childless American couple, a painter and a sociologist, neither young nor rich, but big-hearted and brave, obviously. And less than 2 years after landing at JFK with such hopeless-looking prospects, Deo was enrolled in Columbia University. I was struck by this story the first time I heard it from Deo, struck by its various remarkable features, by its drama. Among other things, it opened up for me a sense of wonder. Having heard what he went through, I felt, or anyway, I hoped that I would never again look at anonymous faces in quite the same way, particularly the faces of people with foreign accents, janitors, hotel maids, taxi drivers, young men delivering groceries. Who are they really? What memories and dreams do they carry? What abilities that they may never get a chance to use? But what drew me to Deo's story, first of all, what made me think I might like to write about this was something rather small. Recounting his time of homelessness, Deo mentioned that before heading for bed in Central Park, he'd look all around to make sure that no one was watching, because anyone who saw him entering the park at that hour would assume that he was homeless. And when he told me this, I thought of my daughter. Once, as a young teenager visiting New York, she began to cross a busy street against the light. My wife yelled at her, and afterward, in cold fury, on the other side of the street, my daughter said, "Thanks a lot, Mom, for ruining my reputation in New York City." I knew that this story of Deo's was true. More than that, I recognized his feelings, and not just in my daughter. I could imagine myself in his place, fearing the eyes of strangers, fearing not the darkness of the park and not what might happen to me if I surrendered myself to sleep there, but the disdain or the pity of strangers who would never be anything more to me than strangers. And feeling this, I thought I could find a way into his story if he decided he was willing to have me tell it in print, as he eventually did. Some years ago, in the context of this book, I think someone told me that I was a purposive writer. By purposive, I think she meant writing that aims to expose and analyze problems and to offer solutions. But somehow it seems important for me to say that I don't deserve that compliment. Some writers do, writers who understand that the world's recurring catastrophes, the grossly inequitable distribution of health, for instance, or events like civil war and genocide, aren't accidents, but the products of socioeconomic and political structures, all with histories that can be unearthed. These writers focus their books on large groups of people. They may pause now and then to describe individuals, but as a rule, they do this in order to illustrate points that they want to make about what seems more important to them, the fates of populations. I respect the motives that often lie behind that kind of writing, to expose suffering in the hope of lessening it, to give, as the saying goes, a voice to the voiceless. I've learned from people who write theoretically, I'm forever in their debt, but I have a hard time bending my mind around generalizations. Often all I can think about are the exceptions. To me, the sheer scale of the big subjects like genocide and war and epidemic disease, makes them incomprehensible through one approach alone. I don't think anyone could claim to understand an event like the Great Depression just by reading about one fictional family's experience in the Grapes of Wrath, but I also don't think you could take in the enormity, that's in the proper sense of enormity, great evil, of the Holocaust without reading at least one account of an individual life enmeshed in the Holocaust. For instance, in Primo Levi's great novel, The Periodic Table. To me, stories can be a window on enormity and enormousness, a means, to borrow from William Blake, to see the world, a world in a grain of sand. I think we're born with special equipment for telling and receiving stories. Stories are one way we organize the world's chaos, and one way in which we pass that information on from generation to generation. The best stories are living monuments to memories that have to be preserved, and they don't need any other justifications, I believe. But other justifications do exist. I used to think that most important job for a writer of stories was to create life on the page. And after I'd said this a few times, my longtime editor, Dick Todd, corrected me. He said the real trick was to get life off the page and into the reader's imagination. And when that happens, readers are able to imagine other lives, including the suffering of others. Stories can create a road to empathy, to sympathetic imagination, and true empathy, I think, is just one of the ingredients for ameliorating suffering, for repairing, let's say, the too often self-serving and largely ineffective approaches that the rich countries of the world have taken in attempting to help the world's poor countries. But I'm off track. I was talking about storytelling. By training, all the Dickens my mother used to read me, and by inclination, probably by deficiency, I understand the world best through stories. And because the engine of any story is human character, I've spent most of my years as a writer looking, first of all, not for subjects, but for characters. A small town cop, Northampton cop, whom I first met because I was speeding. My wife also met him the same day and for the same reason, but he didn't give her a ticket. It turned out that he didn't usually give women tickets because he hated to see women cry. This interested me. There was a pair of old men in a nursing home room in Northampton as well, who were spending their time in that vestibule to eternity doing something more interesting and more difficult than playing bingo, which was making friends. A team of computer engineers trying to build a new machine, essentially against their company's wishes. I remember that my interest in those engineers quickened when one of the team took me aside and told me about what he called the wars. He used all this martial language. There was blood on the floor. There were people who shot from the hip. And as near as I could tell, he was talking about the creation of immobile plastic boxes. On one occasion, I set out to find a person in a profession, an elementary school teacher, but once I found her in a grubby elementary school in Holyoke, what I set out to do was tell the story of a year inside her classroom. If that story happened to reveal some general truths about the problems of public education in America, so much the better, I felt. But it would have been impossible, at least for me, to generalize that teacher and her class with them so vividly alive in front of me. I once wrote a book about the building of a house over in Amherst, an idea I got from having been my own incompetent, indeed dangerous carpenter for a time. But what fascinated me once I got into that project were the carpenters and the homeowners and the architect and the relations among them, a menage a trois without sexual connotations. My book, Mountains Beyond Mountains, really began when I ran into Dr. Paul Farmer by accident in Haiti, and Strength in What Remains began in much the same way when I met Dale Gracias on a visit to Paul Farmer. I was interested in both cases initially, not in the issues that interested those men, but in the outlines of their lives, which seemed eminently suited to storytelling. I probably shouldn't admit this, but what I aspire to is art. Art has the great power to transform the experience of suffering and injustice into something beautiful. And I think, others have said this, of course, that art is created with a certain obliviousness to commerce and also to didacticism. The great storyteller Jorge Luis Borges once said that if you're telling a story about time, the one word forbidden you is the word time. When you talk about a book you've written, you're expected quite legitimately to say what it's about. And yet, when it comes to this book, I wrote Strength in What Remains, I don't feel entirely confident about any of my answers. I do know it's not about Africa, conceived by so many of us Americans as one vast dysfunctional country. And I didn't want to make Burundi seem exotic. I wanted to make it comprehensible. We hear about mass slaughter in distant countries, and we imagine that murder and mayhem define those places. I think in the back of my mind, I hope that Deo's story would humanize our view of Burundi and also open up a part of New York that's designed to be invisible. The service entrances of the Upper East Side, the camping sites the homeless people make in Central Park, or at least did back then. What else is this book about? It certainly has to do with war and genocide and with courage and endurance, the generosity of strangers, the uses and disuses of memory. But we already know the truths about those subjects, that war and genocide are deplorable, that human beings are capable of great resilience, that charity happens, that memory can be an ungovernable torment. What I wanted, without ever telling myself this, was to allow readers to experience those facts, not as truisms, but as we experience them in our lives, to experience them again through Deo. The writers I most admire all do this. They make the world new again. This book, Strength in What Remains, is divided into two sections. In the first, I recount Deo's memories, my words mostly, but his memories entirely. This is a tale of survival, despair and determination, evil and kindness. It's a story of a person not all that different from most of us, who through no act of his own is put in extraordinary, perilous situations. It's the kind of story that might make you wonder, how would I have fared if I'd been in his place? The second part of my book recounts my journeys with Deo, my own journeys back to the stations of his life in New York and in Rwanda and in Burundi. It strikes me as mildly ironic that I decided to leave my New England neighborhood just when I'd begun to feel too old, too fussy, too addicted to my comforts for Deo's kind of travel. By the time I went to Africa with him, I had very little appetite left for interminable plane rides and none at all for riding around in what I imagined were dangerous places. On one occasion in Burundi, I found myself so spooked that I asked Deo not to take me to a certain village. Actually, I remember that I demanded that he not take me there, which is a curious act for a writer if you think about it. Although in my defense, I have to say that I had some reason before he set out. Deo had assured me that we would be very safe in Burundi, but then he also said that he'd rather that I didn't take notes openly, that I should not publicly utter the names Hutu or Tutsi, and that I should never, never speak the word genocide. From time to time, as we drove around, he'd say things like, "These people are crazy. They'll kill you for nothing." In part, I think this is a story about coming to terms with memory. That's why my book is structured as it is, the reason for its doubleness. The story I tell isn't only about memories I heard from Dale, but also about seeing him overtaken by memories again and again, acutely overtaken in several places, including locales he hadn't seen since his escape 13 years before, the village where he was born and raised, and the hospital where he was nearly killed at the onset of the Civil War, and where his long travail began. I've read stories by people who escaped genocide. Not all, but many make two assertions that I don't believe in. The first is God chose to save me, which leaves one wondering about God's disposition toward those who had their heads cut off. The second assertion leaves me dubious. The second one that leaves me dubious is, and everything is just fine now. How in fact can a person deal with memories like Deo's? Tormenting memories, memories with a distinctly ungovernable quality, memories that come back in gusts. I think part of the partial answer that he's found began to come to him while he was a student at Columbia. He majored in biochemistry there, and clearly not for practical reasons, he also majored in philosophy. When I asked him why philosophy, he said, "I wanted to understand what had happened to me." I remember touring the campus with him and stopping out in front of Columbia's venerable philosophy hall, where a casting of Rodin's famous statue, The Thinker, sits on a pediment, chin on hand, brooding. Later, thinking back on that tour, I ended up writing this. I imagined him sitting late at night in one of Butler Library's 24-hour study rooms, poring over the likes of Kant and Hume and Plato, his favorite of all the philosophers he read, looking for a means to close the gap between what he'd experienced and what he was able to say, looking for something reliable in a world that had become untrustworthy, looking for some sort of structured belief, some grand encyclopedia with an index in which he could look up genocide and learn where it fit in the universe. He was, I imagine, looking for an antidote to loneliness, both cosmic and personal, and needless to say, he hadn't quite found it. It was pleasant to think of Deo there on that lovely campus, safe and far away from horror after all that he'd endured. But that distance and safety must also inevitably have stood like a wall between his memories and his attempts to make sense of them. What Deo had experienced made Deo mysterious, especially there. I tried to picture him with his books on his way to philosophy classes, hurrying past the thinker, several tons of gravitas that might have said to a less experienced undergraduate, "This is what thinking looks like." Columbia was, I think, the place where Deo's mind began to heal, if you'll permit me that overused word. But it wasn't the whole answer. Traveling with him in Burundi and Rwanda, I sometimes felt there was no answer. One trip to the remnant of a hospital where his long flight had begun seemed as strange and dreadful as a nightmare, but part because when Deo entered that place, he went into something like an angry trance, and I felt as though I was inside one of his nightmares, looking around at the cause of the nightmare. In Rwanda, there are a lot of memorial sites, places full of bones of the victims of the genocide of 1994. We visited many of those, including one mass graveyard from which Deo had narrowly escaped. At every one, he wept. And in Burundi, men don't weep in public. One time he wept, as it were, by laughing raucously afterward, laughing over memories of hiding among corpses and wishing he were a bird, laughing at horror, laughing in a way that made me fear for his sanity briefly, until I realized that this was another of the methods he used to preserve his sanity. I think that the storyteller's central job is to catch the reflection of individual human beings, each by definition unique on the page. But the richest nonfiction stories ask for more than narrative. I couldn't tell Paul Farmer's story without explaining some facts about infectious disease and its distribution in the world. And I couldn't tell Deo's story without attempting to explain some of the history of violence in Rwanda and Burundi. For me, things that have to be explained feel like gifts, or at least like opportunities. If it's the narrative that persuades a reader to sit still for some expository writing, it's the exposition that offers one way around the tyranny of the linear narrative, around a simple one thing after another kind of storytelling. So while I've always been drawn, first of all, to individual characters, I have, of course, been drawn to try to understand the worlds that they inhabit, especially the subjects that preoccupy them. In Deo's case, two of the main subjects were and are public health and medicine, and the ravaged state of his native country after 13 years of civil war. His story has a denouement, really a continuation. It's gone way on long after I stopped following it, bigger than the beginning, which still amazes me. When I began following him around, Deo had permanent residency status, was soon to become an American citizen. He didn't have to go back to Burundi. He could have lived a decent, even exemplary life in the United States, as many refugees have. No one could have blamed him if he'd stayed away from Burundi, where public health was all but non-existent. And even now, a woman has a 1 in 12 lifetime chance of dying in childbirth, where infant and childhood mortality rates are the second highest in the world, where hospitalized patients, this was true, at one point, who couldn't pay their bills were detained, imprisoned essentially without food or care, but mainly because of those ills. Deo returned continually, and amid the post-war wreckage, with the help of his legions of friends and family, he created an organization called Village Health Works, which built a clinic first, and then a public health system, and now a whole healthcare system, a hospital, all sorts of things. I'll show you some pictures. Free, it's all free to those who can't pay, and it's situated in a rural village. It isn't easy to build something like this. The clinic was a pile of rocks when I visited this site with Deo in the summer of 2006. By December 2007, it was providing food to the hungriest people in the area and clean water to all of them. And it was also a medical center, which I don't even know how many they're treating now. About 5 years after it started, it was 20,000 a year, almost all of them for free. There was then and still is nothing quite like this operation elsewhere in Burundi. People came there for help from all over the country and still do. Some patients were coming on week-long treks from other countries, Congo and Tanzania. And some visitors would come not for medical help, but only to look at the clinic. When Deo asked one of those travelers why he was there, the man replied, "To see America." In his widely publicized speech in Ghana, President Obama, remember him, imagined a partnership between the United States and Africa, one grounded in mutual responsibility that might help Africans pursue the intimately related goals of democracy, opportunity, health, and the peaceful resolution of conflict. Village Health Works is one small example, a model of African American cooperation, Obama's lofty vision embodied in miniature, an instrument of peace. For Deo, I think creating Village Health Works is in part a way to deal with memory. In the end, it's neither forgetting the past nor dwelling on the past that's worked for him. For him, I think the answer has been remembering and acting. There's also been the realization of an old dream, a dream of his youth, to build a clinic that would serve the kinds of people he grew up with. So it seems to represent a welding back together of his life, a life that was torn in two by war. And I think that, like all true idealists, ones who combine idealism and competence, Deo wanted to build something larger than himself. Burundi is a country that was ripped apart by largely artificial differences between two groups of people, differences exaggerated for the advantage of a few, entrepreneurs of violence. Deo has inspired an antidote, the beginning of an antidote, which focuses on something that unites all of us, our common vulnerability to illness and injury, our common hope for life. Personally, I'm moved by this effort of Deo's. When I visited Burundi with him, I saw any number of dismaying scenes. And even in the village where he planned to build a clinic, malnourished mothers and babies, people dying for lack of common inexpensive medicines and simple medical procedures. When we witness scenes like those, most of us tend to feel that we've incurred an obligation at least to try to do something. It's a way of dealing with one's own discomfort, but sometimes the impulse can be useful to others as well. I remember visiting the site, the clinic, 16 years ago now. I went with Deo, several of his friends, several young American doctors and medical students. A lot of the village, hundreds of people turned out to meet us. There were greetings, chants of Amahoro, which means peace, and the speech from Deo, which the villagers cheered, and then speeches from the town's elders, then speeches from Deo's American friends, which Deo translated into Kirundi. And near the end of all this, he asked me if I wanted to say something. And of course I did. I always do, alas. When many people in your village are sick and you have no clinic, it's a terrible thing to be told that it will take time to build one, I said, but it will take time, I added. Looking at all those faces, imagining them both skeptical and hopeful, I felt inspired. And I said, but I promise you that we will do everything we can to get this clinic built. As Deo translated my words, I thought first they sounded pretty good in Kirundi, and then I thought the equivalent of oh dear, had it really been necessary to use the word promise. So I gave Village Healthworks some money and found a couple of others to do the same. It wasn't hard to do. It wasn't a very large sum, but it was enough to begin to appease my conscience and, more important, obviously, to help get construction started. The fact is that getting something worthwhile done in a place like Burundi doesn't cost much in the way of money. Even now, we Americans still have tremendous power to help purchase better lives for people in places like Burundi. What's required is that we invest wisely, not in self-serving aid organizations, but in groups like Village Healthworks. You could look it up. It's if you add a .org to Village Healthworks. I want to read you a little thing. One reason that this health center has grown so and has enjoyed so much local support, extraordinary support from both ethnic groups who used to be at war with each other, is because of the women there who have a large say, still have a large say in the health center's operations. And right at the moment, they're building a gigantic women's health center, the first thing of its kind in Burundi's history. But I want to read you this little passage from near the end of my book and then be done with talking so much. Speaking at a fundraiser in New York, Deo told this story. This past summer, we needed some help to make a road that goes to our site passable. A friend of mine told me, well, Deo, there's a great Belgian construction company that builds roads in Burundi and Rwanda and the Congo. And I was so excited. So I went to talk to the representative of the company. He sent someone to look at the road and estimated it cost at least $50,000 US, not to pave the road, but just to widen it and make it passable. I went back frustrated, wondering how to tell the Kigutu community this bad news. As I was explaining this to them, one woman with a baby crying on her back said to me, you will not pay a penny for this road. We become so much sick because we are poor, but we are not poor because we are lazy. We will work on this road with our own hands. The next day, 166 people showed up with pickaxes, hoes, machetes, and other tools. One of the volunteers was a woman who came to work with a sick child. When a friend of mine and I looked at the baby, we saw that the baby was sweating. I then asked the mother why she came to work with a child that sick. And she said to me, well, I've already lost 3 children, and I know this one is next, whether I stay home or come to work here. So it's better for me to join others and make my contribution, which will help to save someone else's child who will be sick but alive when you have a clinic in Kigutu. The entire road, 6 kilometers long, was rebuilt by these people with machetes and hoes. The same day the road was finished, the representative of the Belgian road construction company called me to negotiate the price. You can imagine how I felt to get that call from him. I said to him, thank you so much for your call, but it's already done. He was obviously shocked and said to me, what do you mean? Who did it? We are the only road construction company in the entire region. And I said, not anymore. I'm going to show you some pictures now. This is Deo in the red shirt. This is the village. These rocks were to be part of the foundation of the first clinic buildings. They were put in the wrong place, which was a auspicious start, I guess. I mean, or a typical one. This is Burundi, just to give you a quick idea, with Rwanda to the north, Tanzania, Congo, East Central Africa. I don't even begin to have time to talk about the troubles that Rwanda and Burundi have shared, except just to explain to you quickly, what happened in Rwanda was a genocide. What happened in Burundi was a civil war between 2 stalemated armies of Hutus and Tutsis. Anyway, and just give you a quick sense of how incredibly poor the country is. This is all from 2006, but most of it's still true today. In fact, even truer, because the country's been through a horrible period of misrule, which will sound familiar, I think, to a lot of Americans. This is an example of what you could have expected right around the time when I went to Burundi if you were going to get an operation there. I won't dwell on it. Here's what places look like. This is up and all in the vicinity of this what is now a big healthcare system. This is the people going out to work on the road. And I think this, I'm not sure if this is the same woman with the sick child, but anyway. And more of the same. I'm sorry, too many of these. This is the site, basically, of what's going to be built, what was built eventually. This is also a very familiar scene if you've ever been to places like this. These are the kids carrying bricks. Just and here's the first clinic buildings. The thing is, I don't think I have any current pictures. I'm sorry, but it's really quite beautiful. You know, there's potable water. They've done a lot since then too for water, which is of course the most powerful public health measure you can make in a very poor country usually. Here are two flags. Dale is very proud of that. He's an American citizen. That's Burundi and that's the US. And then you can see the enthusiasm for a health clinic, for a health center. Just the crowds who came. One of the things they do is they've been trying to, a lot of things are destroyed in the war, including a lot of cultural things are not just suspended, some just suspended, but this Burundi is famous for its traditional drumming. And so they have, the health center has been sponsored to that, to revival of that, as well as a bunch of other things. But it's apparently, it's just spectacular. And there's a lot of dancing that goes with it. This is the staff residence, and you can see they were already overfilled. Lots of solar energy there now, which is really helpful because gasoline is just tremendous, and oil tremendously expensive and hard to get. They rely heavily on community health workers for their efforts in the community, the ever-widening community. I've gotten a lot of help from the organization, Paul Farmer's organization, Partners in Health. This is Dee Dee Farmer, Paul's wife. I'm afraid it's with her back to us. But this is formal training beginning. And by the way, that provides jobs to people, good jobs, and tremendously important jobs. And this is just how it was for the longest time. Such demand, and given the resources. But everything has improved. Here was the first pharmacy. And eventually the good parts, some of the good things of the modern world coming here. This equipment has allowed them to do some surgery before they had their own emergency surgery, before they had their own real facilities and surgeons. But people in a remote place could instruct someone right online. I just like that picture. Dale took that. He's a very good photographer. This is Paul Farmer visiting and examining a child with tuberculosis who survived. Gosh, it's so long ago now. Dale's made amazing partnerships with various people, various organizations and people, including the Gates Foundation and others. There's never enough. This is a good friend of his, an American doc named Ziwe Ntaba, who came and just left his job in the States for quite some time and came to work there, treating a kid who had been burned. A perennial problem in places that use, that have open fires for cooking. This is a man who had AIDS and was basically put in a room to die, but was treated. And looks pretty good, or looked pretty good then. I haven't seen him for this is one of my favorite sequences of pictures. This little boy whom they found, just abandoned, I guess. or wait a minute, I forget the story. He was, in any case, severely malnourished. And what's here? Then he got treated by, they're wonderful Burundian doctors there. It's not all Americans by any means. In fact, it's almost entirely indigenous with of course, help from here. So anyway, this kid was pretty sick and they treated him with that astonishingly powerful medicine known as food. So there he is. Here's the sort of prenatal conference teaching women. Burundi for years was a pretty misogynist country. Women had virtually no rights. And this kind of counseling is really important, I gather. Birth control and so on. Oh, kids. And there are lots of there's a lot of work. Malnutrition is a big problem there and still is, although they've made enormous strides. You can see tremendously important. This is the Dalai Lama giving Deo an award. And just to give you a sense of what the hospital site looks like, this is the Lake Tanganyika, which is the second deepest lake in the world. Big, long, beautiful thing. And one last one. So, and here's the pitch. I don't know if this is current anymore, but so I'm going to stop screen sharing here and answer some questions. Right? That's the idea. Do you, so Naomi, you're going to ask them for
yeah.
Okay.
I'm going to say a couple words, but first, thank you. That was just wonderful.
Well, thanks.
Your words, your pictures, sharing Dale with us, your art.
Thanks.
And the first, that was powerful. First, what we like to do after a talk is give you a word from our sponsor. That's us, Northampton Neighbors. And we don't build roads, but we do build community. And
right.
We're free because we want to be inclusive. But we have expenses. So I know these are hard times for many people and it's difficult to give, but if you can, we would very much appreciate a donation to Northampton Neighbors. And I think Nina is going to put up this is how you can contribute. You can send a check, you can you can send a check to Northampton Neighbors, P.O. Box 231 Northampton, Mass, or by PayPal or credit card, and we would very much appreciate it. I also want to say that we have 2 additional impressive speakers coming up. Some of you may know their work as well. They're speaking, Linda Desmond and Kathy Service. We're going to give a talk titled On Dementia, a New Theory in Practice on December 4th. We invite you to join us and look forward to seeing you. So now we're ready to turn to questions. Please put them in chat. Do you have any questions? I think probably everybody's just sort of so taken with your talk that.
Okay.
Here's one. I don't know if he's going to tell us this. What are you working on now?
I've been on it. Well, it is kind of hard. It's a book about another book about a doctor, about a medical person. I've been working on it really in one way or another since, gosh, for almost 7 years. Has to do with homelessness. Has to do with sort of model of how medicine could be. I probably shouldn't talk too much about it now. I'm not done yet, but I hope to be done pretty soon.
Okay, well, you've got a lot of people looking forward to it. How do you go about first outlining your work?
Outlining it? I don't, well, usually my life divides into, my professional life divides into two parts, is the research and the writing, but they always bleed into each other. I don't, sometimes the only kinds of outlines I really write or believe in, I don't want to spend a lot of time on anything that isn't actually the piece of writing itself. But I do sometimes make lists of things. I almost always use these yellow legal pads and I write at the top elements. And then I just list them and then I just start. And I write fast as I can to prevent remorse for having written badly. I dearly miss my editor, Richard Todd, who lived up in Ashfield for a long time. He was my editor for 46 years. And we had a way of working together that I think is pretty unusual. It was fun. I miss him now, especially. I think when the Gazette called me after his death, they did a nice thing about that. I found myself saying to the wonderful, smart young reporter something that was weird but true, that the morning after he died, I reached for the phone, really intending to call him to ask him how I should deal with his death, which was just, but I still sort of feel that way. I'm at a point, what I miss most is having him tell me what's wrong. I mean, as well as suggestions of how to fix it. And what I know I'm going to miss most of all from him is having someone whom I trust to tell me when I'm done. It's basically possible to write a book forever. So.
Has the pandemic affected your writing, focus, energy, whatever?
No, I don't think so. It's actually, in some ways, oddly enough, it's been helpful. I mean, I'm just doing what I would be doing anyway. It has prevented me from doing some things that I have to do. In Boston, I have to get stuff I just assumed I'd be doing by now, and I just can't do. It's just not possible. So I don't know how that's going to delay things. Things that are really more or less legal matters, permissions and so on. We have a set of rules in this country. As a really brilliant man on medicine and health and so on once said, HIPAA it's called. He said it should be repealed and replaced. It gets in the way of a lot of good things, but it also makes it very difficult to do some of the kinds of writing I'm trying to do. You have to have really pretty elaborate. Anyway, it's complicated, but I need to learn more about it, and I need to make sure I obey every stricture of it. And people, you can't write about people's health after they're dead, for instance. So that becomes a problem if you're trying to write about someone who is no longer alive.
Have your children read all of your books? Are either of them writers? Grandchildren?
No. No, my grandchildren are too young still to read them. My children, I think my children probably have, or at least some of them. I think so. I think they probably have. Yeah, my daughter's an awfully busy doctor running an emergency department in Boston now, so you can imagine. I don't know, but I think she's read everything, and she has lots of talents, and one of them is writing, but she hasn't got time for that now. On the other hand, she's collecting lots of stories, I think. And my son is graphic design guy. He's out west. I think they've read most of them. I don't know for sure. I don't question them. I don't ask, give them tests on that.
Okay, here's another one. For aspiring or actively practicing nonfiction writers, are there resources or authors you turn to, or to whose work you continue to reflect on when you seek direction or lessons for your writing practice?
It's interesting. I think it's interesting to me. I don't usually turn to nonfiction writers for inspiration or ideas. Lately, what I do mostly is read poetry. And I tend to memorize it. Partly that's to help me sleep at night. But I think the person I used to turn to always was Melville. I'd have a copy of Moby Dick, and when I was feeling discouraged, I'd open it at random and read a bit, and usually made me feel like getting my hand back in. However, there are some nonfiction writers I feel like are certainly worth studying for just sheer elegance and, of sentences and structure and so on. John McPhee is pretty hard to beat. I always loved George Orwell, particularly his book Homage to Catalonia. But there are dozens, hundreds, thousands. One of the great things about literature, about all the arts, is that we have essentially an inexhaustible supply of things that are worth spending time with, I think.
One of the things I meant to say in the introduction was that one answer to that might be his book, Good Prose, which he wrote with Dick Todd, which I read when I realized he was going to come. It's an incredible, anybody who writes should read it, about writing and rewriting. He didn't mention it, so I will.
Yeah, I like that book. I like looking at it because it reminds me of him, and yeah.
Somebody said, I seem to remember that the book had a sad ending. Is that correct? And if so, why? I think you must be talking about Strength in What Remains.
Oh, I don't think it's too sad. The ending has him in a tent overseeing the construction of the first clinic in this village. I don't think it's too sad. I think it's kind of upbeat. It certainly went on from there to good things. But the story is sad and difficult. I think how could it not be? But it does. I don't know. I don't think it's sad.
Somebody asked how much of his family survived. He returned and
everyone, unbelievably. His family, his siblings, every single one of his siblings managed one way or another to go to college, which is kind of extraordinary. I'd like to see their genome. I'd like to show it to some of those people who think that there's somehow inferiority in African, all that silliness, stupidness, and vicious stupidness. Two of them, many of them have had to leave the country, have fled it one way or another. Two of his brothers are really members of our family now. They both came here some time ago and did extremely well. They both graduated from Williams. One is getting his PhD in chemistry, and another young man named Pacific Iranhunda, Irankunda, has got a beautiful book. Has written a beautiful book that Random House will be publishing sometime next year. It's called the title comes from a Burundian saying, which is "The tears of a man flow inward." It's really good, really astonishing.
So here's a different kind of question. What is the key to getting the trust of the people you write about?
Hanging around with them for a long time, not betraying them, I guess. That's a tricky thing, though. It always is a tricky thing. And you have to always remember that, I think that I'm a better person when I'm doing my work than I am ordinarily. I think I listen better, but not as well as I should. Still, I do try to be a good guest in their lives. And I try to tell them the truth about what I know as to what they might expect and what, I don't know. But it is hard. I don't believe in at least not for my purposes, I don't believe in hard, tough questioning, the kind of thing that 60 Minutes does say, or pretends to do. Not sure they actually do it, because I know they happen to, they'll take a piece of footage and then ask a different question in the stuff they show on TV than they actually asked in real time. But never mind. I don't know. I really, I don't know. It doesn't always work. and I do try to warn people, if what I try to do is to get, to make sure someone's really willing to do this beforehand. That isn't always foolproof, but I do try to do that.
I think we probably have time for one more question.
Yeah, I do have to run pretty soon, but yeah, sure. One
Okay, so
more.
this will be the last, and then
Okay, thanks.
goodbye. When you encounter injustice, do you fight getting angry or work it into your writing?
Well, it depends. It's not I believe in, what did Wordsworth say? Motion recollected in tranquility. Injustice is pretty, it's not hard to find. Once in a while, I wrote something not so long ago in the book that I'm working on about what a homeless person experienced in the municipal court of Boston. I hope. I mean, it's not my style. I don't think it works to get screaming on a page. I don't believe in that. Although I'm grateful sometimes when others do, but I think this is pretty. That bit of writing is pretty fueled by anger. I mean, it's just so awful. Anyway. But listen, I thank you. It was fun to do this. I'm afraid I've scheduled myself.
I think we're out of time anyway. So perfect. It's 4 o'clock. You did a fabulous job.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
You're entirely welcome. Nice to be with all of you.
Bye.
Bye.